Mr. Speaker, I rise to have the bill entitled the Covid-19 Prevention and Control Bill 2020 read a second time and to lead the debate on this critically important piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, you would note that this bill had its first reading on the 15th of October this year, in 2020. Mr. Speaker, could any of us have anticipated that as we rang in the new year on January the 1st, in the year of our Lord 2020, that we could find ourselves before the end of the first quarter of this same year battling against a new and potentially lethal threat to our way of life, to our country, to our economy, to life itself. We could not have imagined, Mr. Speaker, that it would become necessary to have to close our borders to international flights, to lock the country down under mandatory curfew, and to impose protective emergency powers within the small and closely knit country. Mr. Speaker, all of this was done in an effort to halt the rapid incursion of this unseen enemy in its tracks. I believe that few of us would ever forget the name of the COVID-19 novel coronavirus, which has plagued every corner of this globe within just a few months and has claimed the lives of over 1 million persons internationally. Mr. Speaker, we all know the new reality. This is what we live in and what has brought us here today. Mr. Speaker, a masked man is no longer a threat. Mr. Speaker, but it is what lies behind the mask that we must seek to protect others and our own selves from. Mr. Speaker, we have been in a proclaimed state of emergency since April of this year. Some may argue that this is no longer necessary, may even argue that it was never necessary. I do not believe, however, Mr. Speaker, that the freedoms that were curtailed during the periods of lockdown were of greater value than the global imperative of protecting the overall health of the nation. And it is so curious, Mr. Speaker, that what is required of us during this unusual time is actually akin to what is required of us in protecting the peace, order, and good governance that is enshrined in our Constitution, where we strive to respect and protect the rights of the entire nation. In that regard, I would like to commend to us, Mr. Speaker, the words from a 1947 book, The Plague, written by the renowned French philosopher, author, journalist, Albert Camus. He states that there is no question of heroism in all of this. It is a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile. But the only means of fighting a plague is common decency. Mr. Speaker, it is common decency why you should wear a mask to protect others from being contaminated by too close personal contact. It is common decency to regulate public behavior during dangerous times. It is common decency, Mr. Speaker, to quarantine those who have been exposed. It is common decency to isolate those who have been infected. It is not politics, Mr. Speaker, but not so common decency. Mr. Speaker, this is not an easy matter over which to govern, but we cannot throw our hands up and abandon ourselves to whatever forces that may threaten to overwhelm us. We must therefore seek to grapple with whatever comes in a manner that will redound to the good of us all. Mr. Speaker, we have witnessed that in some other countries, approaches less stringent than ours have been adopted, and unfortunately, those countries have paid dearly with high rates of infection and loss of many lives. Mr. Speaker, although we are standing at the gate that is holding back the onslaught, there is no guarantee that we would be able to stem the tide of the contagion. What we can do, however, is to continue to be vigilant and to not grow weary in doing what is necessary to keep this nation safe. Mr. Speaker, the threat is not over. At this peculiar season, we need to brace ourselves, pray for the best, and also pray to be prepared for the worst. If we must tie our belts, then we will tie our belts together. If we must restrict our movements, then we do so with the conviction that this is what must be done to protect our country, ourselves, and each other. So, if we must stand in lines, that is what we will do. If we must work remotely, then those who can will work virtually to keep the country going. Those who can't will persist in working smartly within the confines of the physical work environment. We must forego some of the usual gatherings and activities that typically form part of this festive season, this carnival season. Then we do what we must for the greater good. Ultimately, there is not one condition on Nevision life that we are willing to sacrifice for greater levels of liberty or luxury. Mr. Speaker, I'm not making light of the loss of liberties and luxuries, but rather I wish to emphasize the high cost that can be exacted from this small nation by reckless and selfish behavior. Mr. Speaker, I think it is the grace of God, the love of country, and the tireless efforts of some dedicated persons that have enabled us to be at this juncture. Mr. Speaker, in that regard, we continue to promote health, safety, and to adopt the legislation for better practical application as we deal with this fluid situation arising from the pandemic. We also do not take lightly, Mr. Speaker, how disruptive this process has been. Even now, the education system is still reeling from the upheaval caused by this particular problem. Just that alone, Mr. Speaker, has come at a very high price for the nation, since education is one of the main vehicles for sustainable development. And within the context of the pandemic, the learning trajectories of our students, not just inside Nevis, but across the world, have been dramatically affected. In fact, it has been estimated that at least 10 million children worldwide will never return to school, Mr. Speaker. The Honorable Minister of Education and his team are working diligently to ensure that this does not happen in St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Speaker, we have also experienced serious disruptions across the business community, both within the private sector and the government. We have seen and heard and felt the devastating impact within tourism and its allied sectors. And we shudder to think of what could happen in the healthcare sector if the pandemic were to visit its wrath upon St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Speaker, that brings us to the objectives behind this particular bill before you today. As we seek to establish a workable framework that would continue to fortify our defenses in the face of the clear and present danger of a common enemy. We will also continue to explore creative ways in which to stimulate the economy, to assist the destitute, and to regulate our affairs in such a way that we continue to promote stability within this country. And so, Mr. Speaker, in that regard, I come to the specifics of the COVID-19 bill that is currently before this Honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the bill has some 5 parts. It has 27 clauses, and it also has some 8 schedules. Clauses 1 to 2 of the bill provide for the preliminary matters of the short title and interpretation. Key definitions and descriptions in the bill include a scientific definition of the COVID-19 coronavirus, as well as references to the Health Emergency Operations Center and the National COVID-19 Task Force. For the purposes of the bill, the expression public place is defined quite broadly to capture a wide selection of places where members of the public would be likely to frequent or gather. Part 2 of the bill is largely focused on the administrative arrangements for the control and management of the coronavirus. Clause 3 of the bill recognizes critically the authority of the Chief Medical Officer as a civil servant having the ultimate responsibility within the Federation for the management of the public health response to the virus. The bill proposes that all national decisions related to the public health management and response to COVID-19 shall be in consultation with and subject to the approval of the Chief Medical Officer, who shall have the final say in respect of those decisions. The proposed powers of the Chief Medical Officer in the bill are commensurate with the powers that are conferred upon the CMO under the long-existing Quarantine Act and the Public Health Act. Additionally, the bill speaks to the relationship of the CMO in reporting to the National Emergency Operating Center once that body has been activated. The bill sets out the essential role of the National COVID-19 Task Force in Clause 4. The powers and duties of the National COVID-19 Task Force include the following: the implementation of national initiatives as it pertains to the prevention, mitigation, and suppression of the spread of COVID-19, inspection and visitation of facilities, including schools, hotels, guest houses, and places of business, as well as oversight of places of quarantine and isolation. To conduct programs of public information and education on the mitigation of, preparedness for, response to, and recovery from COVID-19, to identify compliance teams to assist in its operations, and to guide the public on the implementation of measures to combat the spread of COVID-19. The role of the compliance team is key, since it is intended to function as part of the operational arm of the National COVID-19 Task Force. And in that regard, a compliance team may visit or inspect any business, enterprise, or office. It may monitor social events and issue fixed penalty notices or tickets to some persons who are in violation of the provisions of this bill. The bill seeks to make it an offense to obstruct a member of the compliance team in the execution of their duties. Mr. Speaker, Part 3 of the bill provides for the basic framework of the public health measures that would be applicable to the control of the virus. As you are aware, Mr. Speaker, most of these requirements would have already been covered in the emergency powers COVID-19 regulations, and the nation is already reasonably familiar with the contents of same. We have been doing them since March, April of this year, and we have had a number of iterations. Clause 5 provides for the possibility of working remotely from home. Clause 6 provides for the need for social distancing as a safety measure. As you're aware, Mr. Speaker, the recommended distance is 6 feet or more between persons, and ideally, establishments should have at least 30 square feet of space for each person. 30 square feet, so 6 by 5 feet around an individual in your place of business would be in 30 square feet. Distance markers should be placed, indicating lines inside the store and a waiting space outside where necessary. Mr. Speaker, Clause 7 provides for the equally well-known hygiene protocol, which is as set out in the schedule to the bill, that's Schedule 2 to the bill, and that is dealing with questions of hand washing and sanitizing and those types of hygiene protocols. Clause 8 speaks to the necessity of wearing of face masks when in the public place. Clause 9 speaks to the restriction of certain social activities and to limits on the number of persons who are gathered for the purposes of events. Clause 10 speaks to the requirements in respect of educational and religious institutions. The specific requirements for these institutions are well outlined and captured in Schedule 2 of the bill. The provisions of the bill are essentially in line with the existing emergency powers COVID-19 regulations in relation to the use and attendance at bars and restaurants, weddings, funerals, and public beaches. These are safety measures to which we have grown accustomed, and which we will urge all our citizens to adhere to. The bill, however, makes a few important changes to the current regulatory framework. Worthy of note are the changes to facilitate international travel and the drastic reduction in the penalty for the non-wearing of a mask. In terms of international travel, with the recent opening of the borders, the entry requirements have been adjusted accordingly, and the bill therefore provides for the movement of more regional and international traffic by including a legislative framework to specifically address this type of travel. This framework includes pre-testing, quarantining, serial testing, and post-testing prior to releasing travelers into the general public. It also includes a detailed protocol for designated places where travelers would be accommodated. In relation to the $500 penalty for not wearing a mask, this would be reduced to a penalty of $100, and the police force and the members of the compliance team would be empowered to issue tickets to persons who breach this law. Testing and treatment are dealt with under Part 4 of the bill. A key takeaway from that part of the bill is the compulsory nature of reporting a positive COVID test in respect of both the person taking the test as well as the lab conducting the test. Again, the objective behind these measures is to keep the virus in check. Public safety and public health are invaluable assets, not just individually, but also nationally. Mr. Speaker, the bill is strongly reflective of the spirit of the emergency COVID-19 regulations, which we have learned to live with over the past several months. The bill is brought before the Parliament at this point in time as we speak to further concretize these arrangements. I want to look, Mr. Speaker, also a bit more at the bill, and I will look, say, at Part 5 of the bill that deals with miscellaneous points such as general penalties, suspension of liquor licenses. It allows the CMO to consult with the minister and make regulations. It speaks to curfew and closure beaches and schedules that are attached. The 8 schedules attached may be amended by an order. I want very quickly, Mr. Speaker, to look at some of the schedules that I spoke to earlier. And these schedules give more oomph and are more descriptive of some of what has been mentioned in the main part of the bill. So, for instance, in Schedule 1, it establishes the composition of the National COVID-19 Task Force. And the chairperson to that task force, as has been for the last few months, is the National Disaster Coordinator, who shall be the chairperson. The Chief Medical Officer, the CMO, is co-chairperson, as has been. The Medical Officer of Health for Nevis is a key member of that task force, as is the Medical Chief of Staff of the General Hospital. There is a Senior Nevis Disaster Management Authority, a Senior Representative of the Ministry of Health, a Senior Representative of the Ministry of National Security, a Senior Representative of the Royal St. Christopher Nevis Police Force, a Senior Representative of the St. Kitts and Nevis Defense Force, a Senior Representative of the Immigration Department, a Senior Representative of the Customs and Excise Department, a Senior Representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a Senior Representative of the Department of Information and Technology. There is also a Senior Representative of the St. Kitts Air and Seaports Authority and a Senior Representative of the Nevis Air and Seaports Authority. The schedule, the task force has co-opted from time to time others in civil society, so that we have had the executive officer of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, as well as members of the Christian community, have from time to time been invited to participate. Schedule 2, as I mentioned earlier, deals with hand washing and sanitizing protocol for good hygiene. It also looks at protocol for privately run educational places of instruction, about mass physical distances, and it speaks to arrival and departure screening protocols. It talks generally about hygiene protocols as critical to how we find non-pharmaceutical ways in which we fight the virus without us having a vaccine in place at this point in time. Schedule 4 of the Act, Mr. Speaker, speaks in a comprehensive way to application of protocol for the hotel industry. And so the hotel industry has laid out, in consultation with their representatives, the Ministry of Tourism, the St. Kitts Tourism Authority, the Nevis Tourism Authority, there is a very broad-based set of protocols in terms of accommodations, in terms of recreational areas, food and beverage, the intermingling or the non-intermingling of guests and those type of things. Part 2 looks at an application form in relation to practice and other matches for sporting events. So that speaks to the management team of the club. A club has to make an application. The reason for the application: proposed date of practice match, participating teams, clubs, number of players, and so forth. But it's a very comprehensive way in which the bill is made to protect all of us and to understand what it is. Schedule 5 deals with reporting protocol. Schedule 6 deals with treatment of persons for COVID-19 and for quarantine, and establishes questions of laboratory tests, of water quarantine sites, and so forth. In Schedule 7, Mr. Speaker, I would want to have members note that when we come to committee, we would want the section of Schedule 7 that was an 8 that was circulated to be replaced by a new Schedule 7 and 8. And that new Schedule 7 and 8, I would ask the clerks to circulate them to members so that they would be au fait with what these deal with. It deals specifically with regional and international travel protocol. Regional and international travel protocol. As we open the borders, this is what is definitely new in relation to our response to COVID-19. There is a form for entry into the Federation, and that form has to have the name of the person, address of the person, proposed date of travel, the name of the airline and flight number, name and location of accredited testing laboratory, result of the test, and we are talking about the RT-PCR test, the gold standard that is required by our health personnel, and the name of COVID-19 approved facility for accommodation. Part 2 of this schedule deals with 1.1, COVID entry requirements upon arrival at the Robert Llewellyn-Bratcher International Airport and the Vance Amory International Airport, Nevis. And it says all inbound travelers to the Federation will be classified as having significant risk of exposure to the virus. So that 1.2 says pre-arrival requirements for all travelers via air and sea. If you want to travel to St. Kitts and Nevis, there are certain requirements, mandatory requirements, that must be carried out. All inbound travelers to the Federation will be required to log on to the COVID-19 national website. All inbound travelers will be required to log onto the COVID-19 national website. And the website is URL https www.knatravelforum.kn before traveling. Before you travel or can travel, you must go to the website of the COVID National Task Force, and this website is www.knatravelforum.kn before traveling. 2, you have to complete and submit the customs, the border or immigration and health entry form with required details, included evidence of a negative COVID-19 PCR test. So online, there will be an online registration form where you have to pick out a section for the customs, you have to fill out a section for border or immigration, and you have to fill out a health section. And in that health section, you should have must take a COVID-19 PCR test to travel to St. Kitts. The PCR test must be done within 3 days of travel. So you can't do it a week before, and that test will not be accepted. So if you're traveling on Saturday, you have to take a test Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to travel Saturday, and you can't travel to St. Kitts. This PCR test must be done at an ISO 17025 CLA accredited laboratory in the traveler's host country. You're leaving from Philadelphia or somewhere in the States, you have to go to a lab there and take that test. Canada, if you're doing it in Barbados, you have to go to a lab there and take that test, the PCR test, before you travel. It has to be an accredited laboratory. You can't go down the road and go in a shop and somebody make up something for you. It will not be accepted. The test must be recorded in English language. You have to be able to read it. All persons must present an authentic laboratory report as support evidence of negative PCR test. Wear a face mask covering both nose and mouth if you're traveling. Undergo focused health screening done by a port health surveillance officer, inclusive of a temporary check. So if you land here at RLB, you land at Vance Emery, you have to go through a focused health screening done by a port health surveillance officer. And included in that is a temporary check, temperature check. If the focused health screening is satisfactory, no evidence of COVID-19 symptoms, that person is then free to leave the airport in an approved COVID-19 taxi. Your family can't come for you. There are taxis that have been certified, trained, and have been trained to take people. They go to the airport and they will then leave the airport with you because you're going into quarantine. 2 of Schedule, this is Schedule 7 I'm talking about, Schedule 7 I'm talking about, of the Act, of the bill. Persons traveling to the Federation with significant risk of exposure to the virus. Inbound travelers, including returning nationals, residents, work permit holders, and tourists. I repeat that. Inbound travelers to the Federation, including returning nationals, residents, work permit holders, and tourists. There are some requirements for tourists, and they're set out quite exhaustively, which basically means that if you're a tourist, you go to an approved hotel where, as a guest, you're vacationing in place, but you're quarantined at that spot for the first 7 days. And I can go on and on. I don't have time, Mr. Speaker, do I, to go through the entire schedule. But it is a very detailed process that anyone who is traveling to St. Nevis must become familiar. They cannot say they do not know or did not hear about it. The COVID bill, the regulations that govern people coming in to St. Nevis require, if you're a tourist, you go to an approved hotel site and you vacation in place. Once you have a negative PCR test and landing and you cleared the protocols at the airport, you must travel in a taxi operated, certified by the tourism authority to that hotel. You then have to be vacationing in the place at that place for the first 7 days. There are approved activities at the hotel. You're not allowed to come out of the hotel and go on the strip or go anywhere in the society to mix with our people. We're protecting our people. But for those 7 days, the hotels that have been approved will have activities for you. Locals going to those hotels must be separated. So one restaurant for the visitors, another restaurant for locals. So we don't intermix and transmit the virus into our society. If you take, after 7 days, you are expected to take a test, a PCR test, and if it's negative, you're then allowed to leave the hotel in an approved bubble. And by that I mean there is a local tour that you can do that's approved by the task force. There are limited tours that are available. You can go on a historic tour of Bastia. You can go a half-island tour down to Brimson Hill and eventually Echo Park. And there's also a tour that you may do on the Scenic Railway and 1 or 2 other tours. But these have been certified by the task force working in conjunction with the tourism authority. And so it's a very strict regime for tourists when they come. This is the first phase. And as we get it right, and we can protect our people, we'll review what else can be added to this. But for now, health and safety of our people as we open up must be paramount. There are also requirements, Mr. Speaker, for in-transit passengers. There are persons who may have symptoms or are asymptomatic as well. In some cases, the medical team may require testing on arrival, and we speak of serial testing. And we have approved hotels, vacation in place. There are diplomats and inbound passengers are travelers with special needs. How do we treat with the flight crew as well. It's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that there are in our first phase some designated hotel sites, so that Four Seasons in Nevis, Park Hyatt, Marriott Vacation Homes, the Royal St. Kitts, Wally in Nevis, a Paradise in Nevis, have all been identified and will be opened up as we go forward with COI and others. And the minister, the member for number 4, would have spoken to that earlier. I should point out, Mr. Speaker, that this schedule, the act, the bill that we have before us, also speaks to entry via seaports. And we have to be as strict at the seaports as we are at the airports. I would end on this, Mr. Speaker, but just reiterating that approval for entry into St. Kitts and Nevis, inbound travelers will only be granted permission to enter the Federation if the following criteria are met. You have submitted a negative COVID-19 PCR test result. You have submitted a reservation for appropriate accommodation as per the protocols. And you have also submitted a consent form, an end-user agreement for a COVID-19 mobile app. And the last section of the schedule speaks to the St. Kitts and Nevis COVID-19 mobile app, XMAP. This XMAP is a clinical management tool that will be used to monitor the inbound traveler for the first 14 days for the duration of stay, if less. The inbound traveler is expected to use this mobile application to update the public health team regarding onset of any COVID-19 symptoms. The public health team will utilize this mobile application to communicate with all inbound travelers during the first 14 days or duration of stay, if less. All inbound travelers will be required to download and install the St. Kitts Nevis COVID-19 mobile app on their phone. All inbound travelers in both categories were expected to have their mobile devices with them during this period of monitoring. And Mr. Speaker, finally, Schedule 8 deals specifically with the fixed penalty notice, the ticket that could be awarded or given by the compliance team or the police as part of prevention and mitigation. It could be without a mask or other contravention of restriction on social activities contrary to the provision of the Act, and so forth. And it's such what the ticket should be. Mr. Speaker, there are different views out there, including the idea that this is all just a 5G fictional hoax. But you don't want to bet your life on that. There's no COVID in St. Kitts and Nevis. What you're all talking about, we don't need this. We don't want you to bet your life on that. Or will you wear your mask, sanitize your hands, and practice social distancing? For me, Mr. Speaker, there's no choice. There's really no choice. Some people say it isn't here. Or why do we need to continue to be vigilant? Why do we need to remain prepared? Because in New York, by the time they identified patient 0, he had been to the temple to pray. He was on the subway and had infected several people. I don't know if you remember, Mr. Speaker, or you're aware of those videos on the internet of hospitals filled with body bags lining the corridors and mass graves in New York City in 2020, this year. In Italy, we can recall the exponential spread. And the hospitals, the corridors, and out in the parking lot with hospital beds. In St. Lucia, right here in our Caribbean region, the OECS, St. Lucia, for many of us, was being hailed as the standard. We need to follow what St. Lucia is doing. Open up. Today, St. Lucia's community spread out of control. 100 and 150 people, confirmed cases. And we had the very sad and unfortunate news that just last Friday in Antigua, a gentleman arrived the Friday before with a negative PCR test. On Wednesday, he's rushed to the hospital, ICU, and by the next day, he has cardiac arrest, died from COVID. We have to be vigilant, not to be played with. We let down our guard, we can be in trouble. In St. Lucia, when they found the bus driver, who was the first case of known community spread, he had been transporting passengers for about a month. In every country, the stories are similar. The virus enters in stealth and begins to spread before the authorities are aware. If we know the cases, we can better mitigate the spread. And that is why we have done well so far. We may not always, however, remain this fortunate. And so we must take those other simple measures to keep safe. And we must never become complacent. We must not forget the lessons paid for with human lives. Mr. Speaker, our goal is to contain the second wave of cases like we did the first. This can be achieved by the safe passage of this bill and the responsible actions of each of us. We all have to act responsibly. Mr. Speaker, as we look towards the future, uncertain as it may be, we hope that these measures would be efficaciously implemented to have the maximum effect in maintaining our low infection rate and non-existent mortality rate. We hope likewise that for a short while we can live with the constraints of this type of law to ensure a greater and more meaningful liberty in the long run. Mr. Speaker, I fervently hope that in the not too distant future that we will be able to reflect on the coronavirus as being a problem of the past that brought our resilience and community spirit of the precious people of St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Speaker, with these few words, this explanation as to the import of this bill, I wish it safe passage and to have the support of the members of this honorable House. May it please you, Mr. Speaker.